Let's talk about Russia's military might. It's a big question on many minds. Is Russia really as strong as it seems, or is it just putting on a show? Since grabbing Crimea back in 2014, Russia's been making some bold moves. We've seen them in Syria, in Ukraine, and even sending military help to places like Venezuela and Africa. Not to mention, they're pushing the envelope with some pretty advanced hypersonic weapons and beefing up their military partnership with China. These actions have got a lot of folks in the West taking a second look at Russia's military strength. But here's where it gets tricky. Everyone's got a different take on it. Is Russia playing a well-thought-out game, or just winging it and grabbing chances as they come? There's the big debate. Is Russia a real threat to the US and its allies, or is it a powerhouse past its prime, trying to look tougher than it really is? We're going to dive into all of this, focusing on one key question in our video. What's the real deal with Russia's military arsenal right now? Let's peel back the layers and find out what's really going on with Russia's military power. For nearly 2 years, Russia has significantly escalated the production of military hardware, greatly surpassing previous levels to meet the demands created by unanticipated challenges in Ukraine. In fact, President Vladimir Putin has specifically called for the ramp-up of production to ensure the success of his special military operation. This might not be enough, though, given the ongoing efforts of the West to bolster Kyiv by supplying weapons worth billions of dollars and imposing unprecedented sanctions on Russia's economy. According to Bekhan Ozdoev, the head of the state-controlled Russian corporation that oversees much of its weapons industry, production volumes for a variety of weapon systems have surged to as much as 10 times their previous rate. This has included the accelerated production of tanks, armored vehicles, rocket launchers, artillery, the Iskander short-range ballistic missile, the Pantsir medium-range surface-to-air missile system, and the hypersonic Kinzhal missile. But still, this has not been enough to keep up with the heavy losses the Russian military has continued to sustain in Ukraine. In fact, a recent independent analysis by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, indicated that battlefield losses and Western sanctions have actually placed the Russian military in a state of decline. According to the CSIS report, nearly 10,000 units of key military equipment, including tanks, trucks, artillery, and drones, have been captured or destroyed so far. Taking heavy losses to some of their newest, most high-tech equipment, including their arsenal of main battle tanks, especially modern ones like the T-90, has been a hard blow to withstand. So far, the estimated number of tanks lost on the battlefield in Ukraine ranges from 2,600 to as much as 3,500. To mitigate these setbacks and hopefully offset their losses, Russia has been forced to tap into older stocks, some dating back to the Cold War and beyond, which has marked a notable decline in their ability to achieve its stated objectives, capture valuable terrain, and hold a persistent front line. But their tank problem only gets worse, given the challenges Russia has faced regarding new tank construction, including production limitations created by heavy Western sanctions. As the Russian defense industry has struggled to source essential components, such as optical systems, ball bearings, and machine tools, manufacturers have been forced to refurbish and reactivate tanks that are now decades old or more. An especially burdensome issue has been a lack of high-quality ball bearings, which are critical for vehicle production. Reportedly, some 55% of Russia's pre-war supply of ball bearings were imported from elsewhere in Europe or North America. Western sanctions, however, have impacted more than just tank and vehicle production. Manned and unmanned aircraft, missiles, and other forms of electronic warfare equipment all require modern, high-tech parts, perhaps the most important being microchips and semiconductors from Taiwan. And Russia's ongoing struggle to acquire these key components has only further diminished the speed and quality of domestic weapons production. To adapt, Moscow has been forced to explore a number of less desirable options. Mainly, it's had to rely on alternative supply routes and lower-quality imports, while also attempting to reproduce Western components and seek out less reliable and often much more costly suppliers. And as sanctions have continued to add up, Russia's supply issues have only gotten more complex, especially when it comes to semiconductors, a critical technology with direct implications to firepower superiority and, ultimately, national security. Semiconductors influence the functionality of a wide array of equipment, ranging from household appliances to sophisticated weapons systems. They are used in guidance systems for missiles, avionics in aircraft, electronic warfare systems, radar, satellite communication, drones, fire control systems, cryptography equipment, various communication systems, and precision-guided munitions. Given the escalating political tensions between the US and China, specifically surrounding Taiwan's status as a free nation, both countries have begun to manufacture their own semiconductors, which has required substantial financial investment as well as government support. But while the US and China compete in the semiconductor race, Russia has largely remained on the sidelines, repeatedly trying and failing to develop semiconductors domestically as their technology trails behind the leaders in the industry by 15 to 20 years. Domestic production has also been severely hindered by sanctions that specifically target Russia's chip manufacturers, depriving them of critical equipment, materials, and intellectual property. And although the Russian government plans to revitalize the industry with a $44 billion investment to be made over the next several years, economic pressure from the West raises doubts about the feasibility of these plans. Apparently, major suppliers like AMD and Intel have also stopped supplying Russia with semiconductors, which caused a temporary suspension of car production due to chip shortages. To get around these challenges, Russia has been importing chips through intermediaries in friendly countries, including Chinese-made chips. But China has also been reluctant to export certain strategically important technologies, saving them instead for their own use. Despite mounting sanctions, however, Western chips still continue to find their way into newly produced Russian drones and other weapons systems, as the West's attempts to enforce secondary sanctions have proven ineffective. Although many sanction-violating supply chains have been identified, they still persist as various nations, including Turkey, assist in the importation of Western dual-use technologies to Russia. Ultimately, Russia's military and economy remain reliant on Western semiconductors and microchips, which means that potentially a scarcity of these technologies could have stalled or blocked the invasion of Ukraine. But that's not what happened. The conflict in Ukraine will someday come to an end, but it appears unlikely that it will be due primarily to a shortage of critical military technology. For now, Russia seems determined to simply outlast the West and their ongoing deliveries of weapons to Ukraine. Putin hopes to win a war of attrition by overwhelming Ukraine with sheer numbers until it can fully deplete Kyiv's military resources. To counter this strategy, it will be important for Ukraine's Western allies to continue supplying technologically superior weapons. It's already been proven that the older tanks in Russia's arsenal are vulnerable to handheld missile systems like the Javelin. Since the end of World War II, Russia has held the title of second strongest global military after the United States. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's arsenal reportedly consisted of nearly 1 million personnel, 1,500 combat aircraft, 7,600 pieces of artillery, and the largest tank force in the world, 12,400 units. Well, these were the numbers on paper at least. When Russia failed to reach Kyiv in the early weeks of the war, a number of Western analysts raised serious doubts about the strength of Russia's forces and depth of its arsenal, ultimately suggesting that Russia's military might not be as superior as Moscow had been claiming. But however you want to look at it, whether it's due to political oversight, Putin's arrogance, or a grave miscalculation by military leadership, Russia's arsenal has taken a big hit, while the exact size of it, then and now, remains unknown. Even the most conservative reports say that Russia has lost at least 69 aircraft, 560 artillery pieces, and 1,600 tanks. So it's no surprise that Russia has continued to dip into its older stock. Its increasing reliance on outdated equipment, such as the T-62 tank, a Soviet-designed main battle tank produced in the early 1960s, has been viewed by many as evidence of Russia's waning arsenal. The Ukrainian government has even suggested that Russia could eventually run out of long-range missiles, but there's no evidence to definitively confirm this claim. Shrugging off these suggestions that their long-range missile stock is nearly depleted, officials at the Kremlin are adamant that they've got plenty to spare and that production is ongoing. But because they haven't disclosed any specific details about the number of missiles fired or their remaining inventory, there's no data available to back up these claims either. When Russia launched a series of missile attacks across Ukraine back in mid-2023, its forces utilized both the bomber-launched Ka-55 and Kh-101 cruise missiles, as well as sea-launched Kalibr cruise missiles and ground-launched Iskander missiles. But how many of these they have left in stock is hard to say. Some military analysts have pointed to Russia's repurposing of the S-300 surface-to-air defense missile systems that were developed during the Cold War and have since been upgraded, as evidence that its forces are running low on more advanced surface-to-air systems. The Biden administration also believes that Russia's use of older subtypes, like the S-300, is evidence that its arsenal is rapidly depleting. But then again, Putin might just be saving his more expensive, advanced missiles for future strikes on higher priority targets. Whether Russia is running short of munitions or simply stockpiling them for a later offensive, it's hard to say. But Moscow does appear to be diversifying its arsenal by ramping up its efforts to train drone pilots, perhaps taking inspiration from Ukraine's successful use of drones. According to the Center for Naval Analysis, CNA, Russia is expanding its first-person view drone instructor program by 1. Standardizing training and 2. Making drone piloting part of its military academy's curriculum. Perhaps later than many countries, Russia has begun to recognize the importance of training instructors in drone and quadcopter operations. Ukraine's successful use of drones to counter the Russian invasion began early on with its Army of Drones program, and this success is what likely kicked off a drone-centered arms race between the two militaries. Over the past year or so, drones have played a crucial role in Russia's arsenal, particularly the Iranian-made Shahed 136 or kamikaze drone. But even Russia's supply of these has dwindled due to heavy destruction by Ukrainian forces. Russia has also been making an effort to increase domestic drone production, a process that relies heavily on components supplied from Iran, but it's still falling short of its goal to manufacture 200 drones per month. Another indication that Russia's arsenal might be running low is the rumor that Russian officials have been asking some of the country's allies to return military equipment and weapons that were previously exported to them. And what's even more surprising, some have apparently obliged. Egypt is reportedly going to return approximately 150 helicopter engines in the coming year. Apparently, Russia has also explored similar arrangements with officials in Pakistan, Belarus, and Brazil. So far, though, Pakistan's foreign ministry has denied being approached by Moscow, while representatives from Brazil said they refused to help out. But Belarus, on the other hand, has reportedly agreed to send 6 Mi-26 heavy transport helicopter engines back to their friends in Moscow. Iran has also been scolded by the West for providing large numbers of Shahed 136s, which have been mostly used to attack elements of Ukraine's infrastructure. And then there's China, which has denied sending weapons to Russia, while firmly maintaining that it holds a neutral position on the war. But this might not be entirely true. According to leaked US government documents, Beijing agreed to provide an incremental supply of weapons to Moscow, camouflaged as civilian items, as long as they would keep the shipment secret. The leaked US intelligence agency report was based on intercepted communications between members of Russia's Secret Service. And in another leaked document, it was suggested that any significant strike on Russian territory using US or NATO weapons would be viewed by China as an escalation, and would therefore justify further arms shipments to Russia. Beijing has denied these allegations, and there's currently no hard evidence proving that any weapons have been sent. But hey, given the way this war is going, can you really blame Putin for trying to enlist as much external support as he can? At the moment, it doesn't seem like either Russia or Ukraine has a big enough ammunition stock to meet the demands of what could be a very high-tempo war of attrition. Even if Russia has historically stockpiled basic weapons and was believed to have started the war with several million artillery shells, these stocks are now running dangerously low. And due largely to Russia's dependence on imports, the impact of Western sanctions and the costs associated with finding certain import substitutes, the price of military equipment has significantly increased. But Ukraine doesn't appear to have enough munitions either, certainly not enough to match Russia's pre-war stockpiles. A steady supply of high-tech weapons from the West, though, has provided them with a significant advantage. With that said, however, many of these Western weapons have come from older, existing stockpiles, and few nations, not even the US, have the luxury of accumulating significantly more weapons than they might need. Which means, unfortunately, that every weapon donated to Ukraine increases the national security risk for the donor nation. But still, as Germany offers up nearly 200 of its Leopard main battle tanks to Ukraine, Russia has turned to North Korea for ballistic missiles and nearly 1 million artillery shells. Iran, too, has been happy to supply drones and larger missiles to the Russian military. These might not be as capable or effective as the ones coming from the West, but Moscow will certainly find a use for them as the war drags on. Compared to Ukraine, Russia also has a much larger manufacturing industry, funded by huge oil revenues, which has largely shifted to support the war effort. This means that Russia, once it gets around the problem of increasing sanctions, has the potential capability to rearm quickly. Ukraine's industrial base is more limited and is quite vulnerable to Russian missile attacks as well. And even if Ukraine hopes to build 1 million more drones in 2024, it still cannot match the potential output capacity of Russia's defense industry, nor does Kyiv have the firepower to seriously threaten its production. So where would Ukraine be without ongoing Western support? Likely it would be overwhelmed by Russia's considerably greater ability to rearm. Fortunately for Ukraine, this support has continued. Its allies in the West have even promised to deliver another 1 million rounds of artillery by 2024. But even so, as Western political support for Ukraine remains robust, Zelensky feels that they have not committed enough financially. And even if the technology provided has given Ukraine an advantage, these high-tech weapons are expensive and can only be gifted in relatively small numbers. Zelensky knows he cannot win without military and financial aid. But he's also made the claim that he's actively warring with Russia on behalf of the Western world, without anyone else having to commit any actual combatants. It's a strong statement, one that shouldn't be taken lightly, for even if Putin might not be a direct threat to the West anytime soon, a Russian victory in Ukraine would inevitably have long-term consequences for much of the international community. Another worrisome practice that could be seen as evidence of a diminishing Russian arsenal is Putin's aggressive, ongoing recruitment campaign. In 2023 alone, over 452,000 individuals were recruited into the Russian military. Apparently in need of more troops though, toward the end of 2023, Putin stated his intention to enlist some 170,000 more soldiers, which would raise the total number of armed forces to over 1.3 million, and the overall number of Russian military personnel to approximately 2.2 million. Putin was sure to emphasize that this augmentation would occur gradually, mostly through the recruitment of volunteers. The Russian Ministry of Defense justified the proposed increase by citing the ongoing threat of NATO expansion, claiming that NATO's forces were assembling near Russia's border and that they were deploying additional air defense systems and strike weapons. Since the war in Ukraine began, Russia has used various strategies to strengthen its army, including drafting conscripts, mobilizing reservists, forming volunteer battalions, and running campaigns to encourage more citizens to enlist. Russian officials have also reportedly offered pardons to prisoners in exchange for military service. And even if all Russian men aged 18 to 30 are obligated to serve 1 year in the military, a considerable number manage to avoid the draft due to health reasons or deferments granted to university students until they graduate, if they cannot be persuaded to enlist early. But these are not necessarily new problems. Troop augmentation, organization, and training has been a long-battled issue within the Russian military system. The peacetime armed forces under the old Soviet system served as more of a training ground for preparing reservists. And even after 1991, Russia's defensive strategy still relied heavily on its capacity to mobilize millions of reservists in anticipation of war or a specific threat. Conscripts previously made up the majority of military units, and very few of these had professional sergeants or non-commissioned officers, NCOs, to organize or train them. The readiness of these units was not determined by their amount of combat training, but rather by meeting adequate staffing numbers. With units like this, executing any strategic operation would require the summoning of reservists, fitting them into incomplete formations known as skeleton units, and then ensuring the necessary weapons and equipment were stored at the correct bases. Ironically, this system tends to work best when 1. The government in charge has no political opponents, 2. The people who are called up lose the opportunity to protect their own interests, and 3. The state owns all the industrial enterprises in the country. In other words, a totalitarian regime or dictatorship, where the state has full control over all spheres of life. And what's the most frightening weapon in the hands of a dictator? That's right, nukes. And Putin has a lot of nukes. After inheriting the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, Russia would actually come to possess the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads in the world. At the moment, Putin has nearly 6,000 nuclear warheads in his arsenal, nearly 600 more than the US. Though likely still intact, around 1,500 of these are retired, while another 2,900 or so are in reserve, leaving approximately 1,600 deployed for strategic use. Around 812 of these are land-based ballistic missiles, 576 are submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and roughly 200 are located at heavy bomber air bases. Combined with the US's roughly 1,600 deployed strategic nuclear warheads, China's 350 warheads, France's 290, and the United Kingdom's 225, that's more than enough to obliterate the world several times over. But if you think that's a lot of nukes, Listen to this. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union's arsenal peaked at around 40,000 nuclear warheads, while the US's reached approximately 30,000. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, however, those numbers have fallen drastically, and only a few countries, including the US, China, France, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, have conducted nuclear tests since then. Russia's last nuclear test was in 1990. But it only takes one push of a button to potentially start a nuclear war. A scary thought considering all the decision-making power regarding the use of Russia's nuclear arsenal lies with Putin. He holds the ultimate authority and has immediate access to the Cheget, or nuclear briefcase, which stays with him at all times. What's also worrying is Russia's overall thought process behind its nuclear doctrine, especially when it comes to non-strategic nuclear weapons, NSNWs, or nuclear weapons designed to be used on a battlefield in military situations. Putin has already made a number of reckless nuclear threats and declared his intentions to station NSNWs in Belarus. Among the global audience that's been closely observing Russia's actions in Ukraine, for many this has generated some very serious concerns. But China has been closely monitoring this conflict too, drawing potential lessons to be used for their own conflicts, perhaps in Taiwan or the broader Indo-Pacific region. What makes Putin's view on using nukes on the battlefield even more worrisome is his desire to remain the dominant force in Ukraine, or at least appear that way, demonstrated by his recklessly high tolerance for personnel and material losses. So we should probably be asking, what would he be willing to do to maintain the upper hand? During the Cold War and subsequent military actions, Russian military leaders have extensively discussed their nuclear options. And it appears that Russia now perceives NSNWs as crucial to deterring foreign action, shaping the battlefield, limiting enemy escalation, and ensuring their own victory. Hoping to gain the advantage over his neighbors, as well as the US and its allies, Putin looks at nuclear weapons as the only way to guarantee Russia's sovereignty and superpower status. And as we've seen, there have been a number of recent events to back this up. Russia's aggressive stance on NSNWs is only reinforced by Putin's perception of the West, which he accurately sees as highly reluctant to use nuclear weapons or accept unnecessary casualties. And even if Putin is somewhat worried that the US will enhance its NSNW options in Europe, he's also confident that he'll be able to detect and respond to any such changes. His confidence is largely due to the Biden administration's history of transparent decision-making and the probability that the European public will object to a US nuclear presence on their continent. To stay at least one step ahead of Putin, US military officials and their allies should likely be reviewing Russian-language military journals for any insights regarding Russia's evolving stance on NSNWs. They should also keep an eye out for changes in Russia's nuclear force posture, especially nuclear storage sites and other related activities. It also wouldn't hurt to monitor, as best they can, Russia's military exercises for any potential NSNW deployment scenarios. But it's not only Putin's philosophy regarding nuclear weapons that has created problems. Big problems, in fact, and not just for the international community, but the Russian people as well. Some analysts believe that the overarching reason for Russia's military failures in Ukraine is that the idea of militarism has become the driving force behind the Russian state. When this is the case, important leadership decisions are based solely on military outcomes, while all economic and social consequences are ignored. The outcome of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is still uncertain, but it's clear that most of the goals Putin had set on February 24, 2022 have not been achieved. This is especially true of his desire for regime change in Ukraine, an issue on which Moscow has faced heavy resistance. Instead, Zelensky and his followers in Kyiv have actually won several significant military victories, increased their popularity with the people, and strengthened its ties to NATO. Putin also seems to have made the mistake of getting caught up in military adventurism, allowing the Russian military and political leadership to make a whole string of adventurous decisions, effectively ignoring all the generally accepted ideas about planning and carrying out military operations. For one example, Russia's armed forces were not assigned purely military tasks. This became obvious when Putin's special military operation was revealed to have no connection to any genuine military or security concerns, even if the Kremlin repeatedly accused the US and its allies of turning Ukraine into a springboard for their own aggressive military actions. Without a clear directive to defeat an enemy on the battlefield, particularly one that poses a clear threat to national security, the Russian military has struggled to concentrate its forces, ensure collaboration between different branches, conduct proper reconnaissance, organize an effective air defense, and effectively use air and artillery strikes. As a result, despite some initial success, Russia has failed to establish military control over much of the territory it was after in Ukraine, strongly suggesting that Moscow misjudged its own military capabilities. Outdated equipment and widespread corruption have also greatly contributed to these failures, but there are still those who believe that the primary cause of Russia's military troubles is its reliance on militarism as the state's primary system of administration. In such a system, where military considerations are exclusively prioritized, the militaristic hierarchy that emerges often distorts even military information, leading to some very poor decisions. During the invasion of Ukraine, for example, the military was tasked with goals they couldn't achieve, while the Kremlin either could not or did not intend to keep its plans secret, and details of the invasion were leaked by US intelligence services to the press. This initial plan proposed attacking Ukraine from 7 directions, a scenario deemed implausible by most experts. It also became obvious in a very short time that Russia's forces simply did not have enough high-precision strike weapons to effectively demoralize their enemy, at least not to the degree that we saw during the first days and weeks of the US operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Russian military planners must have assumed that Ukraine's central defense would quickly collapse in the initial hours, leading to the evacuation of Ukraine's leadership from the country. Evidence of this assumption can be seen in the early advancement of several brigades toward the outskirts of Kyiv, even though a force that size stood little chance of capturing a city of nearly 3 million people. This expectation of encountering minimal organized resistance might also explain why troop columns lacked the necessary reconnaissance support and air cover. As a consequence, these units were hit by numerous artillery ambushes and airstrikes. Putin's strategic failure can also be seen in the fact that columns of Rosgvardia troops, anti-riot law enforcement units, followed the initial advancing troops, carrying minimal heavy weapons. These units were supposed to come in and control already occupied territories, not assist in their capture. But perhaps the most clear piece of evidence that Putin fumbled the ball is that the Russian-Ukrainian war looks very little like a war of the modern age, but closer to a series of battles from the industrial rather than the digital era. The use of precision weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles seem to play only a limited role. While most of the fighting is being conducted by weapon systems, tanks, multiple rocket launchers, barrel artillery, and aircraft, improved forms of those used during the wars of the mid-20th century. And as a result, the fighting itself more closely resembles battles of the Korean War compared to the US's battles with the Iraqi army. Realistically, Russia should have won by now. Its population is at least 3 times the size of Ukraine's, which should have theoretically provided a significant advantage in terms of manpower and defense industry production. With this in mind, however, here's another question. What if NATO steps in? What would happen then? In terms of military strength, how does NATO actually stack up against Russia? Well, as of 2023, NATO had approximately 3.36 million active military personnel, over 1 million more than Russia. Collectively, the 30 countries that make up NATO also outnumbered Russia in terms of aircraft, 20,633 to 4,182, and naval power, 2,151 total military ships to Russia's 598. But in terms of ground combat vehicles, including tanks, as well as their respective nuclear arsenals, NATO and Russia are about even. Who is more powerful overall? That's a complex question. The military capabilities of NATO and Russia, as well as any other nation, are shaped by a range of factors, such as manpower, defense budgets, nuclear capabilities, military equipment and technology, and cyber capabilities. When we're looking at military equipment and technology, Russia boasts a thriving defense industry and possesses some advanced military technologies, but NATO benefits greatly from the wealth of advanced weapon systems and equipment it can source from its various member states, particularly the US. Both NATO and Russia have strategically invested in enhanced cyber warfare capabilities, and Russia has even been implicated in a range of successful cyber attacks. So we've looked at troops, nukes, and cyber capabilities, but what about military spending? While Russia's annual defense budget typically ranges between $60 to $70 billion, the collective NATO members reportedly allocated over $1 trillion for defense in 2021, with the US contributing the most. So NATO definitely has them there. But that hasn't stopped Putin from allocating a huge amount of Russia's national budget to military spending. In fact, the budget he proposed for 2024 allocates 6% of the nation's GDP to military expenditures, double the amount from the year before. This will be the first time in modern history that Russia intends to allocate more for military spending than social spending, which clearly shows where the priorities of the Kremlin stand right now, mainly winning the war against Ukraine and the West, a crucial piece of the puzzle in terms of Russia's economic survival. One fairly obvious thing we can conclude from Russia's unprecedented increase in defense spending is that Putin has no intentions of concluding his war with Ukraine anytime soon. Even if the intensity of the fighting decreases or the conflict enters a standstill, the allocated funds will most likely go toward replenishing Russia's depleted arsenal. Either way, the problem of misinformation, as well as blatant corruption within the defense sector, will only undercut the effectiveness of any allocated funds. So Putin might want to address these issues first, before simply throwing more cash at the issue. What's even scarier is that his budget for 2024 includes reserve funds in the case of any potential escalations, situations that might require the imposition of martial law or a full military mobilization of the Russian people. Social spending is still projected to be 7.5 trillion rubles, an increase of about 1 trillion rubles. National security expenditure will also increase from 3.2 trillion rubles to 3.5 trillion rubles, but education and healthcare spending is expected to stay the same. Despite these commitments, however, Russia's Economic Development Ministry anticipates just a 4.5% increase in inflation. But this might not turn out to be realistic, considering the proposed increases in defense and social spending will likely be financed through the gradual devaluation of the ruble, a downslide that's apparently already happening. In 2024, the average ruble to US dollar exchange rate is expected to be around 90 to 1. This time last year, it was around 70 to 1. Moscow's emphasis on defense spending suggests that it's not only preparing for a long, drawn-out war in Ukraine, but is expecting some sort of economic benefits from the conflict. Already, a number of industries that are directly and indirectly linked to the war, such as transport, computers, electronics, navigation devices, electrical equipment, protective clothing, and equipment repair, have witnessed substantial growth. Using war as an economic strategy, however, does not come without serious risks, including the rise of a war-driven economy that's highly dependent on imports and is susceptible to high inflation, evaluated interest rates, and riskier investments. Putin's current approach could force the economy into a perpetual state of war, leaving ordinary Russians to bear the ultimate cost in terms of living standards and economic stability. But who knows? Perhaps all this extra cash will help revive the promising Sadyukov reforms introduced by former Defense Minister Anatoly Sadyukov back in 2009. These reforms marked a significant overhaul of Russia's forces. Drawing on Soviet-era experiences in Afghanistan, Sadyukov introduced battalion tactical groups, BTGs. Comprising around 800 soldiers, BTGs could be deployed as versatile, combined arms maneuver units and were maintained at a high state of readiness. It was Sadyukov's intention to integrate BTGs into standing brigades, in the hope of reducing the overall size of the army, streamlining the command structure, establishing a professional NCO corps, and enhancing overall readiness. But he was fired by Putin in November 2012 under suspicion of embezzlement and property fraud, and was later charged with negligence related to the misuse of ministry funds. These reforms, however well-intentioned, coupled with Russia's military success in Chechnya and Syria, likely contributed to the false perception that its military was well prepared to start invading its neighbors. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 further solidified this confidence, as did assurances among Putin's inner circle regarding major advancements to Russia's weapon systems, including its nuclear capabilities, ballistic missile submarines, and improved armor units, including the new generation T-14 Armata tank. In 2021, Russian sources claimed the military had more than 2,000 field-ready T-14s, but other evidence suggests that it was closer to a few dozen prototypes that were still in development. Highly skewed figures like these are not uncommon, as internal corruption continues to erode the strength of Russia's industrial defense sector and armed forces, while severely impacting the lives of Russian military personnel as well. What we've seen since the war in Ukraine began is a complex web of corruption within the Russian military, where individual soldiers, to keep up with basic standards of living, have resorted to stealing and selling equipment. But institutional corruption is also prevalent, manifesting as sets of informal rules and corrupt habits that are followed by many Russian officers. And at the highest level, Russian corruption takes the form of convoluted relationships between the Kremlin, the military, and the institutions appointed to govern them. So far, we've seen frontline soldiers lacking helmets, radios, backpacks, camouflage nets, sleeping bags, and bulletproof vests. Recently, supplies have run so short that some Russian bloggers, including military veterans, have started crowdfunding campaigns to raise money for essential items like tourniquets, medical supplies, and night vision goggles. Evidence also suggests that crucial gear, including body armor, often fails to reach intended recipients. Corruption within the supply chain has been backed up by reports of stolen body armor plates showing up for sale online. Mismanagement of funds and blatant corruption have also led to many Russian troops trying to procure essential equipment themselves, often making do with a mix of pilfered foreign equipment. Conscripts often receive used uniforms, and there's been reports of soldiers going without food for days or relying on ration packets that expired nearly a decade ago. Corruption has no doubt had a negative impact on the morale, effectiveness, and overall readiness of the Russian military, and yet, even with a dwindling arsenal, combined with a number of other notable setbacks, it would still be a mistake to completely underestimate Russia's capabilities and resilience. While the Ukrainian military does appear to be far superior in terms of combat effectiveness and morale, Russian forces have been able to adapt and learn from their experiences, which likely makes the Russian military today more capable than it was in February 2022. With the help of massive troop augmentations and some mostly under-the-table support from its few remaining allies, the Russian military seems to be effectively dug in for what's turning out to be a long, bloody war of attrition. But what do you think? Is Russia's arsenal too depleted at this point to outlast the Ukrainians? How has Putin's overall philosophy and strategy shaped the war? What is ultimately going to win this war for either side? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content from military experts.